It's been some time since we talked, but I also have uh, kind of a. I mean, I'm really glad to hear from you because I have a definite liking for the vision that you had and a lot of the thoughts you had about play and where you wanted to go with it. And you said you've done a lot of kind of sandblasting.
Um, yeah. Uh, so it's it's a whole story. I took a lot away from what you said, and I thought about it for a long time. And so what I did is I more or less started over,
Mhm.
and the game is extremely different. I can't even call it 2.0
Mhm.
because
Yeah.
it's so different. Where I'm at is I started over, and I think I'm still in the design and creation process, but I've been playtesting with my friends. I feel that it's a much as I say, closer to the bone. It's much more the experience that I was reaching for.
Excellent.
So I figure I can I can tell you about it, try to walk you through where it's at, and I kind of have specific ideas of what I'm looking for as far as consulting this time. I think I'm
I will
after our talk,
happily
I've really
take
focused.
those notes for sure. So you go right ahead.
Okay.
Why don't you? Why don't? It's really easy to go down all the possible alleyways when you start describing how it works. So rather than,
Right.
if you can, let's focus on the big changes that occur to characters or situations and how they get that way. Right? How do they
Okay.
change? If a big change occurs, how did it occur? Without explaining like every last little point. I mean, what did they
Right.
do?
Right.
How?
Right.
Yeah. Tell me that, and
I,
that'll orient me
I've been
better
thinking
for
about
everything
this.
else. Yeah.
Okay. So the big thing is because I was wanting it to be more collaborative. So, um, and I changed the framework a lot, but I've done a major change in how the game is played in two phases. Where one phase is more what it was, where you have the Doomsmith
Hmm.
running scenes, you have your the choices that are being made and those sorts of things. But then you have another phase where the players get to set the scene and they kind of spend resources to set these scenes. And then you play through it in that regard. So that's a major change. Um, and then the other really big change is finally getting to the end times um, kind of mechanic. So before there were a lot of things that could affect the die rolls, and now it's all shrunken down.
Hmm.
After the die roll, there's only one thing that you have an option to. Once the dice have been cast, you can do what's called generate a dharma. And this is a point that gives you a reroll or maybe an automatic success. So anytime that you don't like the results, this is your go-to if you want to
Hmm.
change it. And these points, these Adharma points, have to be taken care of.
Uh-huh.
And during the player phase, they have to take care of these points by either um, narrating some sort of sin that they do, something that makes their character a little darker,
Hmm.
and they get to choose what that is, or they give it to the Doomsmith, and the Doomsmith darkens the world. It darkens the setting. It makes more monsters pop up. It starts killing the world. It starts running the apocalypse.
Right. Right. So I guess so that's
And
kind of
then
interesting.
and
You
then
could you if you basically it's quite clear thematically. I mean, you're basically being selfish, more or less, depending on what you were trying to do. Or you want whatever it was you wanted to accomplish it so much that you're basically choosing it over the fate of the world.
right,
And I'm sure one little point, one more little point, one more little point isn't enough to do it, obviously, but keep this sort of thing up collectively across the group, and guess what? Am I
Yes.
catch? Okay.
Yep.
So I
That's right.
see. Okay. So with this kind of structure in mind and having simplified it so that it jumps out and isn't lost in a sea of point and roll manipulations,
Mm-hmm.
um, then uh, then the next question, uh, I'm dying to ask questions about the the colorful stuff that you did, like the all the stuff about like the burn guy and the crazy
Mm-hmm.
shit, of all the
Yeah.
different
Right. Right.
options and stuff. And also I'm real interested in what you preserved or didn't preserve about that kind of life pathy mode of character creation. All of those things are
Mm-hmm.
I'm dying to ask about. But instead, bite my tongue and ask, what were you thinking of in terms of the console? Did
Okay.
you, yeah,
So, yeah. So, really, the big thing is this where it's a shared narrative and trying to hone in on defining that a little bit and
right,
how it works. So, for example, one of the things that stings me when I do this burn the world kind of thing, what kinds of things I feel comfortable with and what kinds of things I don't. So, excuse me. So, where is it that it's fun to use these points and burn the world and make it darker? But where is it that I'm taking player agency away? I don't want
right,
to, you know. So
right.
that's a big concern. Um,
That's actually an
so
important
there's
term you've
that.
used. Go ahead, go ahead. Yeah. Um,
Uh, and then with I have a general question about how advancement works because I'm using the same mechanic where you advance your character with the same resource that you use to build your scenes and craft your story.
right,
So I
right.
want to kind of dive into that and see
Mhm.
if that works or if it needs to kind of be
Right. Do
parsed out.
they could be
Um,
broken apart or they could be combined. There are systems which do one or the other. So, um, yeah. Let me write that down. Between
yeah,
advance versus scene setting, etc. Okay, that's interesting because that's scene setting stuff with the power. That goes back to the Dharma points, right?
right,
Okay,
right,
so the question is not whether that should happen because that seems like it's a very important point now. The question is whether those points should have anything whatsoever to do with character improvement. Should character improvement be its own
right,
process with its own metrics of whatever. And also, how many metrics do we want
right,
to fill the place with? How easy should it be to keep track of and to do? All those things, right? Um,
right.
yeah, so I see that. Let's take a look then. Um, well, first of all, I have to say you're absolutely. I couldn't have hit. Huh, I couldn't have hit two issues that were closer to the core of any role playing system. Even if we specify that improvement question to just development of any kind rather than improvement. And if we uh, put aside the question of whether you're, for example, darkening the world or making it better or whatever, but any level of change of that kind, these are the things that are absolutely central. I mean, and once they get better felt, then that's when we go to things like resolution and see whether it's fitting in nicely, right, to that. So,
Right.
the or as I'm sure people are getting sick of me hearing, a roll to hit is a subroutine of leveling up or dying,
Mm,
right? So it's that's what I'm thinking
mhm.
about. So everything you asked about is great. When somebody comes to me and says something like, "Hey, let's talk about this game. Here's my core resolution mechanic." I'm always like, wait, hold on, back up. Let's look at these other issues instead, and then we can talk about your resolution. So, all this is just a long winded way to say this sounds great. This is this is my kind of thing to investigate.
Okay, great.
Um, so yes, those I see, and then I'm going to ask you um, a little more about how you perceive something that you mentioned, so
Mhm.
that our language for it can not, so that when I talk about it, I'm not talking about something else by accident.
Right.
Um, and the word is player agency. And I want to distinguish between two concepts that I've been using a lot in consulting and in teaching, because I've been teaching a lot of classes about this lately too.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, which is kind of fun. It helps me get my ideas together for sure. Nothing like a bunch of skeptical, argumentative people to, you know, to say,
Yeah.
now how should I think about this? How should I talk about it? So anyway, I want to distinguish between what I think of as a rules procedural issue, which is actually where most people are stuck, um,
Okay.
which is what I call the authorities. We might have talked about those before, but it has to do with who kind of has the finalizing voice for something that happens or how
Yeah.
something is or what it is. And a good example, probably the best example I can come up with, is somebody says my character walks across the room, talks to the bartender. And the question is whether someone else at the table says yes to establish that this indeed happens. And if that's the case, then that person also kind of reserves the right to also say, no, this girl comes up and starts talking in your face first. Right? That's the in other the that's the that's one way to do it. Another way is when the
Hmm.
person says, I walk across and talk to the bartender, and it was their go, if you will, to say what actually occurs with that character at that time. And so nobody gets to say, game master or no game master. The game master may have made up the bar and made up the backstory and everything, but me saying I go and talk to the bartender, I'm freaking there talking to the bartender. Okay, that's just how it is.
Hmm.
So the in each case, both people had to talk, right? The game master had to say, okay, you're in this bar and it's like this and it's like that. And who knows, the game master has this, this woman ready to come bug my character. Maybe she's going to knife him or something or whatever. And yet the authority is different in terms of who finalizes where my character goes. I mean, he had to do that. I had to say my character goes there no matter what. We both got to say those things. The question is who's got kind of the finalizing uh, notions, right? The one who says it into the air that everybody hears that this is the way
Right.
it goes. And so there's four kinds of authority, and none of them. And what I try to get across is that I'm not talking about the authority to override anything. I'm not talking about overriding someone else's authority if they have it, right? If that's the way we understand we do it. Saying I have the authority over, over this doesn't mean you can go and step on theirs. And then another thing is that I'm not talking about overriding any procedures. When we have procedures like dice or whatever, those are accepted constraints for how we do our authorities, right? I mean, in other words,
Right.
I may have the outcome authority, which is another kind. I might have the outcome authority to say what happens when you kill the goblin, but I have agreed effectively to abide by these dice when I do it, right? You may have
Mhm.
noticed that in any game, I've never seen, I mean, talking, what, 45 fucking years of role playing, and I have never seen this not happen. Somebody rolls their dice and says, you know, 16 points of damage. And whoever it is looks at the little, looks at the little chart, anybody looks at the little chart, maybe that says, instant kill, or maybe somebody looks up their goblin's hit points, right, and checks it, whatever, but the goblin's dead by the numbers. Somebody is in charge of saying, and the goblin's dead. It has to be stated. Nobody just checks the numbers and we move on. Somebody states it into the air that this has occurred. And it's always the same person for those specific tasks. So, sometimes you have authorities that switch around, but that's okay. The point is that we know who it is. When everybody at the table knows whose job that is at that time. So authorities are pretty cool, the way they're organized and how they're differently organized in different games. They're really cool. Then you mentioned this thing called agency. And the way I look at the way I've been using the word is the notion that it matters who you are when we play. It matters when presented with a specific array of things we've just done. And that could result in my character being poisoned and having a chance to live, or my character is in a position of fantastic advantage. I'm getting a +3 now, or whatever it is, right? Anything. That when I'm in my zone of authority of what I get to say happens, or with or without instruments, when I'm in that zone, does it matter who I am in any way that will matter to anyone else? Do I just get to describe it, but it doesn't mean shit, and it could have been described anything, right? So who cares? Or does it super matter what I choose to do that nobody can tell? It would be a different person in the chair. They may have chosen something else right then, And so it's more of a nebulous thing. It's not a rule. It's how people interact with the rules. I have played a number of games lately where there actually isn't any agency. And they claim it's full of it because they say you can say whatever you want. They say this is a narrative game. You can say whatever you want. You're free, right? You have all this power. Well, it's crap. We're all just babbling into the air, right? And that card is sitting there doing what the card's going to do, no matter what I say. So you see what I mean? So I'm interested in agency, and I've discovered something that I always suspected, that you actually have more when you're operating under changing constraints as you play. Because that's when we see what you're made of, if you see what I mean. Right? That's what we see. Yeah.
Right.
So I'm really interested in both of those issues when you're talking about setting those, using the Dharma points and setting the scenes and stuff like that. What you're doing is you're talking about a transference of authority. What I'm interested in is the nature of the constraint, right? What has gone on fictionally and what has gone on with the points, so that when I look at my little Dharma points and say, oh, okay, we got to set it's our turn now. We're going to do our scene now, right? We're going to do, the way, it's our go, if you will, for this kind of scene setting. I'm real interested in the shape of what I have to work with that is different from the last time we did it. And that's cool, right? So I'm interested in the shift in authorities and what they are, and I'm interested in what the points do and how we operate with them for that quality. Right?
Okay.
That's
so then I feel like the issue in my mind is dealing exactly with these things that you brought up, and kind of both of them.
Yeah.
Okay. So what I've done so far, and I've changed this a couple of times because it's still very malleable in my head.
That's a good thing.
And we've played with different versions. So, normally what happens is when you burn the world, right? When you give a point to the Doomsmith and say, "Here you go, the world's going to get darker." Typically, it's just a die roll, and it looks on a chart, and it kind of says what areas um, the world gets burned in. So some of them are fairly easy, I feel like, to add to the fiction. So it doesn't require a scene like the weather cools or the crops don't grow as well. There's a famine, like like the sun struggles across the sky. These sort of descriptive things that just changes the feeling of the setting, right? But then there are other times, and this is the one that gets to me, is like something where, okay, this Dark Lord rises, right? Like this Sauron type of um, tyrant, and as you're activating this, and the player is kind of moving this Dark Lord and making the world darker by taking over stuff. Like, is it a problem if the player moves this Dark Lord into the location of the players, like where they happen to be, and says that now this town is under control? Something like that. And there's
I
no
thought the game
because
master. I thought the game master does that with the Dharma point, not the player.
well, I've done both, where the game master will say this, but sometimes I've been like, okay, what does the Dark Lord do? Here's your option. He takes a city. What city does he take? Or something like that, Um, and
I see.
so
Right,
it's
right.
like
What you're doing, okay, this more jargon. Aren't you lucky? Um, Instead of saying setting these days, and this goes back to my game Circle of Hands,
Mhm.
instead of saying setting,
Okay.
I've been talking about we're going to look at what we're playing right now, and everything that what we're doing right now is embedded in, we're just going to call that the situation. Okay, so the thing about
Okay.
a situation is that it could get in our faces in play, or we could get in its face during play, even if we're not doing so right now in this scene. Even if it's not happening right in this scene, it
Okay.
could happen in the course of us playing this session. There's enough going on here, right? I mean, we heard about this lake up in the hills. We could go hike up to that lake, right? I mean, it's there. So this
Hmm.
is the situation. Now, if you then think, especially for a game like yours, of the huger, bigger picture, what most people would think of as the big setting, right? Or what gets written up in gazetteers and stuff. That's the backdrop.
Right.
The backdrop, because we're not touching it. And the interesting thing is this, that in real play, backdrop is not actually the master of play. You'd think it would be because it's the biggest, right? And we would reference the backdrop all the time, but we don't. We play situations.
Right.
And
That makes sense.
yeah, and only by playing situations does the backdrop get validated. Otherwise, it's just a promise.
Right.
Yeah, and so with that in mind, what you're talking about with these Dharma points is clearly we're changing the backdrop with the Dharma points no matter what. The
Mhm.
question is how much they're going to penetrate situation, and who gets to say that, because situation authority is one of my authorities, right? So,
That is exactly, yes. You've hit it exactly on the head. That's exactly right.
yay for jargon.